Hello, this is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind, a part of ThinkTech Hawaii. We are joyful because we are joined here today by Dr. Milton Chen, who at one time was part of PBS San Francisco and then had a very long career working as the ED for the George Lucas Educational Foundation. Welcome, Milton.
Thanks, Carl. Pleasure to be with you. And I just wish we were together in person.
So, first question. When you were first working at PBS San Francisco, what were you doing? And specifically, what was your work involving children and violence on television?
Well, I had been involved with PBS since I started my career at Sesame Workshop. And Sesame Street obviously was on PBS, continues to be for many, many years. So I got to know the PBS system a bit. And then when I came back from serving as a junior faculty and a professor of education in 1987 or so, I joined KQED. That's the call letters of our PBS station in San Francisco as their education director and served there for about 10 years. Um, People will laugh at when I say we were actually managing an instructional television system of broadcast on three PBS stations in Fresno and Sacramento and San Francisco. So the teachers could actually use television in the classroom at the time that it was broadcast. This was 1987, which seems like a long time ago, but in the scope of a few decades and maybe not that long ago, it's just the technology has progressed so quickly. So we were managing instructional television for K-12 teachers. We were doing workshops for parents around the use of preschool programs such as Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and generally trying to promote the use of television in education, including some telecourses for community colleges.
Without getting too political, I want to ask you what the effect is. There's a movement now to withdraw money from PBS nationally, and a lot of children, including my own and your own, were raised on Sesame Street and Mister Rogers. And I want to just get your take on what the effect that will be for children who you work so diligently with and so wonderfully with. When you were working at PBS KQED.
It's not the first time that Congress has tried to withdraw funding for public broadcasting, TV, and radio in this country. It seems to happen pretty regularly, at least once or twice a decade. So, yes, I think it's unfortunate and it is very political because it doesn't save that much money in the federal budget. I think the annual allocation for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting from the federal budget is less than 500 million, maybe 450 million a year, which works out to maybe $1 and change per American. So it's a few dollars per household. So it is really an effort to try to um, launch an attack against the kind of programming that's on NPR and PBS.
How did you respond previously, and what do you think people could do now to sort of ensure that the type of programming um, that you so diligently sponsored will continue?
Well, as CPB and Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS and NPR have asked, please write to your local members of Congress. And it would help to also copy your governor and your state legislators. States provide some funding for public media. Here in California, we do not. It's kind of amazing that we don't provide any funding for public media, given how important a role it's played in California in covering California stories and news and politics and culture. But yes, please make your voice known. Write to your local representatives, federal, state, and local, and let them know that you think public broadcasting is a great investment, especially since it's, again, maybe a few dollars per household.
Well, 3 decades ago or so, I may have this wrong. You came to Hawaii to speak at the Punahou School in the chapel, and to other students besides, and you talked about violence on television and how that affects children. You wrote a book about it, so I'm sure I'm bringing up a subject you know a lot about, but could you tell us a little bit about that?
And in fact, concern about media violence, television violence goes back to the 1970s. There was a very extensive research program sponsored by the Surgeon General of the United States to look into this question. The best scholars, there was a major research effort. And so did a little bit of work around some of that in the 70s, and then into the 80s and 90s, as there continued to be increasing waves of television violence. I became concerned about it. And you're right, I did a lot of writing about it. I did a special at KQED, our PBS station here in San Francisco, called The Smart Parent's Guide to TV Violence. And I have not looked at the latest statistics, but I know that media violence continues. You only have to look at some of the most popular video games that young boys play, adolescent boys play, to see that not just the kind of violence, but the amount of violence has continued. So I became very concerned about that, and tried to educate parents and policymakers about really understanding that media violence is not just completely innocuous, but can have an effect in several ways. And I'm sure one of the ways I've mentioned it when I spoke at Punahou was not just the connection between watching television violence and then committing violent acts. There's a fair bit of research supporting that connection between the imitation of violence, seeing it on television or now on screens, and becoming more violent yourself, but also the impact of watching a lot of media violence on your own mindset, on your own psychology as a child. Back then in the 90s, when I was writing more about this, uh, some of the research suggested by the time a child finishes sixth grade, they will have seen more than 100,000 acts of violence on television, including 8,000 murders, if you can believe that. And I was telling parents, can you imagine if you're not monitoring your child's viewing, would you right now say you would agree to having your child watch that amount of violence? And a lot of parents would recoil and say, of course not. I wouldn't want to see I wouldn't want to see that myself, but I wouldn't want my child to see that. But in fact, that is the cumulative toll. And so children who watch that kind of violence, and these are averages, a lot of kids watch a lot more than that. 4 hours of television a day. A lot of kids are spending a lot more time than that these days on screens of various sorts. But yes, the impact on your own mental outlook and believing, as George Gerbner, a professor of communication at the University of Pennsylvania at the Annenberg School of Communication, said, a kind of mean world effect, that children began to believe that the world was a lot more violent and a lot meaner than was true in reality, and therefore began to arm themselves psychologically and maybe physically, wanting to procure weapons, wanting to fight back. So the effect on a child's psychology was also even more prevalent.
Do you think that the show, Mr. Rogers, was a counter effect to that? Because I remember one day complaining to my older sister, saying, after watching Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers seems a little vacuous, and she took me to task, and she said, this is the one place at time of day when things can be calm and people can be gentle, and she used the word kind. But I'm going to let you answer the question. But how do you think that Mr. Rogers answers a bit of this, this focus on violence on television?
Well, Carl, I'm sure you've probably heard this before, but your sister was right. Yes, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is a great example of a program that is an antidote to television violence. In fact, his messages around kindness, about being kind to others, not immediately becoming angry, becoming violent, hitting other kids. Yes, his program was a great way of not only communicating with kids about kindness and nonviolence, but also with parents. Parents who watched that program with their children began to understand the language of talking with your children about these issues. So Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood continues to be a great, my granddaughter is going to be 5 soon, has seen programs of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and his successor, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, an animated series featuring Daniel Tiger, one of his characters now, on PBS. So yes, and when we're talking about congressional support for public media, there's a YouTube video of Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, testifying before Congress in a very moving way that convinced members of Congress that they should continue support for public media. So this goes back to the 1970s and 80s.
Okay, we're going to move on a little bit now and move to your George Lucas Educational Foundation work, and your work at PBS had you coming out to Hawaii and to Punahou. But tell us a little bit about that work, and especially your magazine Edutopia. And what was your main focus? And I know again, you wrote a book based on this work. So all those questions are wrapped up into one.
I sometimes say, Carl, that I've been very fortunate in my career, which, if you look at it, the main theme of my career has been educational innovation. How to use media, Sesame Street, and other programs we talked about for innovative education. And then also my work at the George Lucas Educational Foundation, edutopia.org. Many educators know that website as a destination for learning about innovations in education, such as project-based learning instead of just strictly textbook-based learning, how to focus on social and emotional learning along with academic learning, and how those two, the heart and the mind, go together in education. So yes, I've been very fortunate to go from what I call the longest street in the world. Sesame Workshop has Sesame Street has circled the globe now. There are versions of Sesame Street in many other countries and have been starting about 50 years ago. As soon as Sesame Street became a phenomenon, became successful here, many other countries said, well, we have real needs in early childhood and we have a television system. We could be broadcasting programs. So, yes, many other countries started to either broadcast Sesame Street in English or began to create their own versions of Sesame Street through some consultation with Sesame Workshop, creating their own puppets, creating their own music in their own languages. Um, First, it started in Europe, Sesamstrasse in Germany, Rue Sésame in French, but also in places like Japan, in China. I first went to China in the early 80s to talk with them with China Central TV, CCTV, about adapting some of the programs of Sesame Street for CCTV. So yes, my career has been very fortunate to go from the longest street in the world to a galaxy long ago and far, far away, and work with George Lucas, who was known as an educational innovator. If you look at edutopia.org, the blueprint for the major agenda of Edutopia comes from George Lucas himself about project-based learning, about social emotional learning, the use of technology and how that could provide new connections for students, both to each other, to teachers, to their communities. That has only continued, and it's been great to see. So, yes, I worked for two educational innovators, the founder of Sesame Street, Joan Cooney in New York City in the 70s and 80s, and then joined George Lucas and his work here in the Bay Area at the Lucas Foundation in the 90s.
So, what was it like working for George Lucas? There's a wonderful picture that I've seen of you standing sort of above him while he looks like he's at work at a computer or some sort of board. So, what was it like? Because he's so internationally well known now.
People often ask me that question about what was he like really, and how much is he involved with the foundation. People sometimes think, well, maybe he just funded the foundation as a kind of act of charity and wasn't, would just hope that something good would come of it. But in fact, he has all along been very involved with the operation of the foundation, meets quarterly with the staff of the foundation to review progress. And yes, as I was saying, the basic agenda of edutopia.org and the things that you see there come from his initial feelings about what are kind of the most important things we'd like to see change about education, including project-based learning, social emotional learning, the use of technology, things like cooperative learning, working together in teams rather than just an individual student doing their own work and being assessed on their own work, but can students work together on some larger project and do something more than one student could do on their own? And a lot of that, his feelings about education, came from not only his own experience growing up in the public schools of Modesto, California, in the Central Valley, and not being very successful in that kind of traditional schooling model, and then all of a sudden becoming very engaged with his own learning once he got to film school at USC. And film is the collaborative medium, right? It's very hard, certainly back then and even today, to make a film completely on your own. Or if so, maybe there would be others who are better at music than you are, or better at editing than you are, that you invite a team to work together. So many of the themes of edutopia.org come from George's own experience in education. And yes, I sometimes like to refer people to his interviews on the Academy of Achievement. The website would be achievement.org. Academy of Achievement is a very interesting organization that was founded initially in Washington, D.C., to expose high school students to leaders in Washington, D.C., or from around the country, maybe even from around the world, in person sessions with leaders. And then pretty quickly evolved through the internet to recorded interviews, much like what we're doing with ThinkTech Hawaii, recording interviews with folks who are telling their stories. And so if you go to achievement.org, you will see just an enormous range of interesting folks, scientists and writers and artists and politicians and others telling their own stories to high school students and people of all ages. So please look up George Lucas's interview at achievement.org, and he'll talk about his own experience, how, boy, if you were his high school teacher, I'm referencing your teaching at Punahou in high school. If you had seen George Lucas in high school in Modesto, California, he was the quiet student in the back, not very engaged, probably getting a C in your class. And you would never have thought that here's someone destined to become one of our most creative and distinguished filmmakers. So it was his own path that got him to where he is today. And it was a great joy to work with him. And I learned so much from him about innovation and about resilience and to keep trying, because even in filmmaking, you hear people telling you a lot of no's. And in fact, Star Wars was a film, just a historical footnote that many Star Wars fans will know, was a film that Fox Studios said, we're not sure what to do with this film. I don't think this is going to go anywhere. So we'll probably, George, could you invest in this film and we'll just finish it off and that'll be it. And George made a deal with Fox that became known as the worst deal ever made in Hollywood.
Milton, you raise the issue of Star Wars, and I just want to ask you two questions related. They're broad questions, and I was recently in Singapore, and I was being hosted a couple of days by this wonderful woman named Janelle, who is the daughter of one of my good friends, like I know your daughter Maggie, and of course my daughter Laura. But you know, we were at a Jurassic Park area in the middle of the Singapore Gardens, and I thought to myself this question, and how does film affect reality? I mean, we see this as entertainment, but then there's all these dinosaurs in this garden and this whole theme park in the middle of Singapore, which I was really shocked at. I had no idea. So how pervasive is this? Of course, that was Steven Spielberg, but how pervasive is the Star Wars culture, and why do you think that works? And the second question is, and it comes from this guide, because I told her about our interview coming up, and she said, "What was George Lucas coming up with a theme of the light and the dark, and what was his overall purpose? And the stars and the villain become related. So what was that all about? I don't know if you could explain both these things in our brief interview, but I wanted you to try to approach them.
I will say that having worked for the Lucas Foundation for 12 years and had some connection with them even till today, that the point about film being entertainment is true, but films can carry even more meaning, can become even more important in one's life, in inspiring people, in giving them messages about how to live. I've met so many Star Wars fans who told me that the film changed their life, that they sense, and many fans sense, that story of the inner journey, I'll put it that way. The hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell would put it, the mythology of great works of literature. Star Wars, you could rank Star Wars in that same effect of when people see the story and see a person trying to um, achieve and do well, and the relationship with what he learns as his father, the forces of good versus the forces of evil. These are universal themes, and many Star Wars fans and viewers understand that. And yes, I remember meeting many people who have said, that was more than just a film to me.
That's great. And what do you think the relationship is between film and reality? Because as I just, as I walked through this theme park that was surrounded by these lovely gardens, I mean, it really is a Singapore garden experience outside of even this theme park. Um, I was thinking to myself, wow, this is sort of the culture of the film becoming alive. And they
Yes.
even had a display of the DNA they used to
Wow.
create these fake dinosaurs. And I thought to myself, "Oh my goodness!" And I'm in the middle of Southeast Asia. I mean, what the heck was going on there?
Yes, and I think that's partly the appeal of theme parks, and Star Wars has many um, theme park exhibits in the Disney parks now. Was always very popular with folks to try to experience the film in a new kind of reality. And you only have to look at virtual reality now when you put on those headsets, and it's coming to goggles and probably contact lenses soon, to see how we're blurring the line between our physical reality and virtual reality. I think we're due, certainly with AI, to see a whole new generation of mediated experiences that will seem very, very real. Imagine, Carl, if you could cast yourself into a film. Um, you could play yourself or some avatar of yourself in a storyline of a film. We're at that point now where media companies are experimenting with, you don't have just to watch other characters, you can see yourself. That becomes very personalized kind of media in a storyline. It might seem like a documentary film, it might seem like a fictional film, but soon we're getting to that point where you'll be able to experience a mediated reality that will seem very, very real.
And this is a question I've never asked you, but I've always appreciated you as a friend for many years. But how did
Likewise.
you maintain, since it's called, this is Journeys of the Mind, your low key framework? I mean, you had a very, very significant job. You were working, my God, with George Lucas, and yet you seem to keep what most people in Hawaii would say sort of a local approach to things, meaning you were very calm, very settled, never getting too egotistical. I probably this is true because of your wife Ruth and your daughter Maggie. But I mean, whatever. How did you keep your even keel? Because people have these stereotypes about people working in Hollywood, which I think are for the most part untrue. But how did you maintain that even keel?
Well, I've always, I think it's a combination of family and schooling and experiences of all sorts. But I've always admired people who could be a little calmer in the midst of a lot of chaos, because I've experienced people who are not at all calm in the middle of chaos. But yes, I've admired people who can maintain their balance. Um, I've become somewhat of a Buddhist myself and trying to practice kindness. Yes, in terms of my wife Ruth and our family, these are values that we all try to live in our daily lives. So yes, I'd like
and
to practice kindness and humility in all things.
And what our audience doesn't know, I mean, you were very modest. Again, you're a professor of education, but at Stanford University, and your wife is also a professor, and your daughter is a medical doctor. So, you've all done well in life, etc. But let me ask you a question related to Hawaii. I have heard that the Indiana Jones series that George Lucas worked with Steven Spielberg on was initially inspired by the founding of Machu Picchu by Hiram Bingham. And of course, in Hawaii, that's such a prominent thing. because the first Hiram Bingham, developed Machu Picchu, and then Hiram Bingham, the second or third, was the founder of Punahou School,
Hmm.
with the monarchy, and then his offspring, Hiram Bingham, saved Jews in France and Marseille,
Wow.
just before World War II, or during World War II. So I wanted to know if you had any information about that. My concluding question is, during your work in Edutopia, um, I found by reading it and using it online, and by the way, there were no students in my classroom sitting in the back and quiet because I put them all in groups so they could discuss things. I think you'd be a better in my classroom at some point at Puto. And also I was very interested in the quiet student because often I found those students to be quite brilliant. And but my question is for Edutopia, what were you trying to do in terms of getting technology into the schools and into, I mean, how are you proceeding? What was your methodology in getting technology into the schools?
That's a great question. And again, ties directly back to George Lucas's own experience with technology in filmmaking. And that became again a central cornerstone of Edutopia. That he believed, and I happen to agree, and therefore our foundation did a lot to sort of show how technology could advance learning. That George himself, well, you could say that he really was I think if you were to point to someone who really advocated for the use of technology, beginning with editing, saying that, why are we looking at long strips of film and using a editing machine and then splicing together strips of film, when if we could digitize these images, it would be a lot easier to move the scenes around and edit them together, look at them in different orders. And that was the beginning of digital editing and filmmaking. But now, today, we see that filmmaking is a complete end to end digital experience. It is filmed on digital cameras. George was one of the first directors with, I believe it was the prequels to Star Wars, starting in maybe 1999, 2002, 2005, to use digital film cameras. And then through digital editing, certainly the sound editing, audio editing, all the way through to presentation in a theater digitally. George cared a lot about how moviegoers experienced his films in a theater. Wanted the theaters, first of all, to be clean, wanted the theaters to have great um, projectors and to have great sound systems. But if you're showing the film on film, at a certain point, you begin to see the scratches. Those of us who are of a certain age remember going to theaters and seeing, that wasn't a great experience visually or in terms of sound. So George saw the benefits of technology and computers and helping to not only make it a better experience, make better films, but also to do it more quickly, to speed up the process. So that became kind of our agenda with technology. Back when I started there in late 90s, we were beginning to see personal computers. We've been beginning to see the early forms of the internet. I sometimes say back when I joined the Lucas Foundation and Edutopia, which we now know as edutopia.org, there was no edutopia.org in 1998. We were providing our first film called Learn and Live with 5 examples of schools doing project-based learning, putting students together in teams to do cooperative learning. Those first films were provided on a VHS cassette in 1998. Pretty quickly, we moved to CDs and DVDs, but sort of mid 2000s, we were thinking about we need to, yeah, even before then, we need to create the website. So yes, we've always been advocates for the internet providing more and better kinds of content. So students were not just limited to their textbooks, to begin to do things like video conferencing with experts from around the world on certain specialties, whether it's world history or whether it's science. So yeah, a lot of our early video segments at Edutopia showcased how this was coming. This was not just So someday you'll see this, but it's going to come sooner than you think, and that's only happened very quickly during the past decade.
I'll finish with this last question. So for the future, and perhaps in the legacy of George Lucas, what would you hope for in terms of technology and education in the future? I know you've been working on this most of your life, or the latter part of your life, and so what would you hope for in the future, Milton?
That's an important question to me because my granddaughter starts kindergarten in a few weeks. So I reflect on what is now possible for a 5-year-old starting school. She'll be starting in a public school in San Francisco. What is now possible for her own learning, for her own use of technology? I've always maintained, going back to Sesame Street, one of the great lessons of Sesame Street more than 50 years ago was that kids back then, preschoolers, can learn a lot more and more quickly than we think they can if we give them the right experiences, if we give them the right experiences and the right media and technology. Back then, the technology was television. Kids could instantly see a segment that was produced in the spring of that year in the fall. So that was some improvement. But now, boy, there's so much that kids can learn. And so my hope would be that schools, especially public schools, certainly private, independent, parochial schools as well, which have a little more flexibility in how the learning is organized. But I still see, um, unfortunately, that a school is a place where there are classrooms, and if you're lucky, 20 students are in that classroom. In most, starting in San Francisco, most starting in middle schools, it's more like 30, 35 students are in that room with one teacher. That I think sets the whole framework for how the learning happens. So my hope would be that we begin to more quickly adopt some of the things that Edutopia talks about around project-based learning, around cooperative learning. And one of the keys to all this is changing the assessment systems of tests and standardized tests and the way they're administered. We still see that going on. So my hope is that creative learning can still be possible. Should certainly be possible for our youngest kids, but could continue pre-K through 12 and beyond.
How lucky we are today to be hosting Dr. or Professor Milton Chen. A theme that I have witnessed today running through your life is really the to use technology to help kids and to help them in many ways, from to protect them from violence on television, to encourage them to live a life like Mr. Rogers in terms of kindness, and finally just to use technology in the classroom and think about different ways to educate, inspired, as you mentioned, in many ways by the great director producer, George Lucas. So, Milton, we thank you very much for being on Think Tech Hawaii. And what I say to our audience is a hui ho and aloha.
Thank you, Carl. It's a pleasure.